My friend Bucky was overjoyed to secure a position at a pharmaceutical business in March. For him, it was an exciting new beginning and an opportunity to fully devote himself to something he was really enthusiastic about. He had always been fascinated by pharmaceuticals, not just because of their scientific foundation, but also because of their ability to significantly impact people's lives. Bucky saw a potential to have a significant impact on something bigger than himself at the organization he joined, which was renowned for its research into innovative medicines. However, the chronic disease that had plagued him for years cast a pall over his joy as he set off on this new expedition. His constant companion has been fibromyalgia, a disorder marked by tiredness, soreness in specific locations, and broad physical pain. This wasn't just a little annoyance for Bucky, it was a daily fight. Everything in his life was impacted by the condition, including his mobility and concentration. Although he was able to manage the discomfort, it remained constant and served as a reminder of his limits. The Personal Independence Payment, PIP, he was granted acknowledged the substantial influence fibromyalgia has on his overall well-being and ability to move about. It was a little but vital assistance that lifted some of the financial stress associated with having a chronic condition. Bucky was resolved not to let his illness define him in spite of this. He wanted to demonstrate to himself and others that he was still capable of making a difference and accomplishing his objectives. It's never easy to start a new job, but for Bucky, it was much more intimidating. In addition to the typical difficulties of taking on a new role, getting to know new coworkers, adjusting to the company's culture, etc., he also had to overcome the extra obstacles brought on by his sickness. Although he was aware that it wouldn't be simple, he was prepared to take on the difficulties. Being a complicated illness, fibromyalgia is often misdiagnosed or misunderstood. For Bucky, the symptoms worsened in the mornings or after prolonged durations of physical activity. His joints may hurt dully or sharply, so much that it was impossible to perform even the most basic actions. He would often have abrupt heat waves that would cause his joints to swell and leave him soaked in perspiration. Another common companion was dizziness, which often made him feel unsteady and often almost fell. The fact that Bucky also fell onto the autistic spectrum added to these difficulties. His autism caused a special set of challenges, especially when it came to communication and social relationships. He often struggled to read social signs, and he felt anxious when others would casually engage in small chat. He struggled when discussions strayed into the implicit or the abstract and liked to communicate in plain, straightforward terms. Although there is still much to learn about autism, Bucky was well aware of the wide range of characteristics linked to the disorder. Even though he had become used to some of these characteristics over the years, they nonetheless made life more difficult for him and compounded his everyday struggles. His fibromyalgia and autism combined to produce a special set of difficulties that were hard for others to comprehend. Bucky disclosed his medical issues to his employer right away when he began working there. He told his prospective employers about his autism and fibromyalgia throughout the interview process. He went over the modifications he would need, such as the option to work from home on days when his symptoms were really bad. To its credit, the business seemed encouraging. They reassured him that they would take the appropriate occupational health measures to support his success and that they were dedicated to diversity. Both his contract and the job offer letter mentioned the company's accommodating work-from-home policy. For Bucky, this was a huge relief since it would help him better control his condition. With a positive outlook on the future, he was keen to establish himself in his new position. Everything looked to be going well for the first few weeks. Bucky was becoming used to his new position, picking up the nuances of the work and gradually getting to know his coworkers. He took care to control his health, making sure he slept when he needed to and avoided overdoing it. When his symptoms flared up, he was especially appreciative of the company's flexible work-from-home policy, which enabled him to work in a more comfortable setting. Then, however, the complaints began. Even if the initial complaint was small-minded, Bucky was nonetheless uneasy. He had gone up to ask the question of one of his coworkers and, as was his custom, had stared at the coworker's computer screen in anticipation of an answer. Bucky used this as a focusing technique, since it helped him control his nervousness, which often accompanied social situations. However, His coworker mistook his actions and accused him of attempting to read private information off the computer and being obtrusive. Bucky found the claim shocking. He was only attempting to find a strategy to control his anxiousness that worked for him. He had no intention of violating his colleague's privacy. In the hopes that his colleague would comprehend, he stated this to them. Bucky was uncomfortable after the occurrence, even though his coworker seemed to accept the explanation. He came to the realization that, while he had learned to deal with his autism, there could be more challenges in this new setting than he had imagined. Bucky persisted in doing his hardest in spite of this failure. He was resolved not to allow one miscommunication stand in the way of his advancement. He put all of his attention into his job and took additional care while interacting with coworkers. However, the event had sowed doubt in his mind, a concern that maybe his new job was not as welcoming as it had first seemed. Everything reached a boiling point last week. Bucky's fibromyalgia symptoms had been flare-uping especially badly. He felt weak and overheated, and his joints were swollen and hurting. He felt dizzy, confused, and lightheaded from the terrible agony. Even though his symptoms were severe, Bucky made an effort to continue. Especially in light of the recent event with his coworker, he was reluctant to take time off work and run the danger of falling behind. But the discomfort became worse as the day went on. He could hardly hold a pen in his swollen hands, much less write on a computer. His heart was racing, and he thought he might faint at any second. He was aware that he had to leave the workplace and return home in order to recuperate. After describing his symptoms to his boss, Bucky asked if he might leave early and work from home the next day. Even his manager, who had previously been encouraging, was surprised by the request. His manager remarked, "You look fine," which really hurt Bucky. It served as a reminder of how invisible his conditions were and how often his suffering went unnoticed by others due to their lack of clear physical symptoms. Bucky was happy to be allowed to leave the workplace, even though his boss had consented to let him go home. Bucky was more than delighted to comply with the company's first aider's advice and work from home the next day. The next morning, he informed his boss via email that his symptoms were so bad that he would be working from home. He anticipated sympathy and assistance. Rather, he got a message that took him completely by surprise. His boss gave him a call and inquired as to why he wasn't at work. As per their agreement, Bucky sent an email earlier, but he couldn't make the trip because of his terrible symptoms. However, he had not expected the answer he received from his management. "You're still on probation," remarked his supervisor, "and the work-from-home policy doesn't apply to you yet." Bucky was blown away. He had never heard of any such limitation before. He had assumed that all workers, regardless of probationary status, were covered under the company's flexible work-from-home policy. He made an effort to clarify this to his management, but it didn't appear like his remarks were heard. His boss had him come into the office and threatened to report him for using sick days on Fridays, which would be seen as suspicious. Bucky thought he was stuck. Though he was in unbearable bodily and mental suffering, he was unable to envision a way out. He made himself get ready and endure the excruciating drive to work. Upon his arrival, he received a verbal warning from his boss on his unprofessional behavior. It was evident that the firm was not as accommodating as they had first expressed. This was just the beginning of the verbal warning. In the days that followed, Bucky saw further indications that he was not as welcome at the organization as he had first believed. The amiable coworkers he had known seemed distant today. They seldom looked him in the eye, and he was often left out of talks. He felt as if a wall had been put up between him and the other members of the team, and he was unable to get beyond it in spite of his best efforts. The loneliness was unbearable. Because of his autism, Bucky had always had difficulty interacting with others, but he had thought that his new work would allow him to meet people who were as passionate about drugs as he was. Rather, he discovered that he was feeling more alone than before. The office, which used to look like a place full of opportunities, now seemed more like a minefield where one mistake might result in further isolation. Bucky's confidence was completely destroyed by the event involving his manager. He started to doubt everything, including his value, his skills, and if he really deserved in the position. He was under tremendous pressure to succeed, and the thought of making another error loomed large over him. He began to second-guess everything he did, fearing that anything might be misconstrued or trigger another complaint. The strain had a negative effect on his mental state. Although Bucky had always been a strong individual, he was becoming exhausted from the ongoing stress of juggling his condition, autism, and work obligations. He began to have trouble falling asleep at night because his mind was always racing with ideas about how he might perform better, what he could do differently, and whether or not he was going to lose all he had fought so hard to achieve. His physical condition was also becoming worse. His fibromyalgia flare-ups increased in frequency and severity, perhaps as a result of the stress he was experiencing. There were days when he could hardly move from his bed due to the constant discomfort. However, he forced himself to continue since he thought that pausing would only make the situation worse. Bucky's boss and an HR representative summoned him to a meeting, which was the tipping point. Bucky was about to be put on a formal performance improvement plan, PIP, so the meeting was short and to the point. The explanations offered were evasive and seemed to cover a wide variety of topics, some of which had a direct bearing on his impairments. In an attempt to provide his side of the story, Bucky discussed how his fibromyalgia and autism impacted his performance and how he was making every effort to manage both conditions while still doing his work duties. However, it looked as if his remarks were unheard. The conference was conducted with a chilly formality, and Bucky felt that his opinions were neither sought for nor appreciated. He felt totally defeated as he left the conference. The PIP seemed to be a death sentence for his future with the firm, an obvious indication that they were trying to find an excuse to fire him. Not only was he afraid of the financial fallout, but he was also afraid of being dismissed because it would validate his deepest worries, that he wasn't competent, that his limitations made him a burden, and that he didn't belong. Over the next several days, Bucky's mental state deteriorated dramatically. Although he had always been resilient, the ongoing anxiety, suffering, and stress were too much for him to handle. He had the impression that there was no way out. He didn't know how to wake up from the nightmare that had become his profession, which had previously seemed like a dream come true. In a last-ditch effort to get assistance, Bucky contacted a union and joined, thinking they would be able to provide him with the assistance he needed. However, the lack of speed in their reaction made him worried that he hadn't been a member long enough for them to be of any real use to him. Bucky felt like he was out of alternatives and time was running out. Bucky found himself in a predicament that became more and more intolerable every day. His mental state was completely destroyed, and his physical symptoms were becoming worse. The once promising work had become a continual source of stress, and he was almost overcome with fear of what was ahead. He thought there was no obvious way out. Bucky looked to his social circle for assistance. His spouse, friends, and family came together to support him and provide guidance. They emphasized to him that nothing was worth sacrificing for a career, and that his health and well-being came first. But despite their help, Bucky was still lost. He was so afraid of losing his work and the stability it offered financially. After yet another long day at the office, Bucky and his partner got down one evening to talk about their alternatives. They discussed Bucky's options, which included quitting his work entirely or taking a leave of absence to concentrate on his health. It was a challenging talk because Bucky knew that things couldn't continue the way they were going, but he also didn't want to give up on everything he had fought so hard for. An important turning point was the consultation with the occupational health consultant. Together, they spoke about the particular difficulties that Bucky had because of his autism and fibromyalgia, and they created a customized strategy that would help him function better. This included making changes to his workspace, such installing an ergonomic keyboard and chair to lessen joint strain, and having a more flexible schedule that enabled him to work from home on days when his symptoms were very bad. In order to better understand Bucky's requirements and promote an inclusive work environment, the expert also suggested that Bucky's coworkers take courses on autism and invisible impairments. This was approved by the corporation, and the training was implemented across the department in a matter of weeks. With the new facilities in place, Bucky started to feel more certain in his position. He no longer felt as like he was fighting an uphill struggle by himself, even though the pain and stress were still there. Even though there was still work to be done, he felt as if the corporation had finally taken notice of his needs and given him another opportunity. Additionally, Bucky's rapport with his coworkers started to strengthen. They were able to better comprehend why he acted differently at times thanks to the training, and they were more understanding and encouraging. He was now seen by them as a valued team member with special talents and difficulties, rather than as an outsider or a problem that needed to be solved. Bucky found himself thinking back on the path that had led him here as he adapted to this new stage of his profession. It had been an excruciatingly painful, frustrating, and fearful period. However, it had also been a time of development. Bucky had gained a great deal of self-awareness about his rights, resiliency, and capacity to stand up for himself in the face of difficulty. Ultimately, Bucky became stronger as a result of the encounter. He had overcome prejudice and miscommunication, emerging from the experience with a fresh sense of purpose and resolve. Not because of his limitations, but rather because he had been able to find the necessary assistance. The work that had previously looked like a nightmare had turned into a place where he could flourish. A monument to the value of tenacity and self-advocacy is Bucky's tale. It serves as a reminder that there is always a path ahead, even when it seems like the cards are stacked against you. Most significantly, however, it's a call to action for businesses worldwide to cherish each and every worker, pay attention to their needs, and provide work conditions where everyone can achieve success.